It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm here to walk you through our show today. We're going to start with a little bit of a recap of last night's action, talk about some of the weather issues, talk about some of the Vegas lines, get into some of the pitching options for the late slate today, and then get into some of the hitter matchups. We're going to do something a little different today with the hitters. I want to try something out and get your feedback on it and see if you guys like it a little bit better. It's basically answer to a question that I've been getting often is, how do you come up with these guys? How do you, go through and do your research? So I switched up the hitter section a little bit today to kind of walk you through how I do my research and how I get some of the guys that I target in the hopes that it helps you guys be able to do, the research on your own on the days that we're not here and, still find your way to the same kind of plays that we try to outline for you when we do our show a couple days a week. So let's get started. Basically, the big news that I wanted to mention first is the DK, the DraftKings and ESPN deal. As we've seen, there's been a lot of action so far this morning. We heard some rumblings about this over at the Fantasy Sports Trade Association conference this week, that the deal, not that it fell apart, but that there seems to be some tweaks that they're making to it. DraftKings is still going to be the exclusive fantasy site of ESPN starting in 2016, but the investment money seems to, be something that's kind of on the hush. We're only getting bits and pieces of the information and what has actually changed in the deal so far, but it looks like there won't be a $250 million investment by Disney into DraftKings, and it looks like DraftKings will not be on the hook for $500,000 in advertising over the next couple years as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. Basically, from what I got from the stuff that I saw that was released by Disney, it seems that their thoughts are they could probably maximize the amount of dollars that they make in their advertising revenue by not having it directly with DraftKings. And I guess DraftKings kind of wanted to balk at the idea of $500,000 in spending on advertising. I mean, that's a lot of money, a lot of money, especially for a startup. If you remember when they were doing fundraising, they were raising, 50, 80, $75 million. So even with the 250 that, ESPN was supposedly going to give them that they were going to get from Disney, they were still on the hook for another $250 million worth of advertising, which, that money has to come from somewhere. Even though we're playing a lot and they're starting to make some money now and they're starting to bring in some cash, $250 million is a lot of money. That's not chump change. So just an interesting development. I'm going to keep watching it, see what kind of information shakes out. I'm sure there's a lot more to this story that we're not privy to at the moment. Maybe Jason and Wrath will be able to shed some more light on it when they do their State of the DFS next week. But like I said, I just wanted to mention it to you guys. It is a big story. You've seen a lot of people writing about it, tweeting about it, and talking about it today. So, I figured I'd mention it to you guys. Keep an eye on it, see what kind of information comes out. Right now, it's still pretty much in the early stages. So let's move on. Talk a little bit about last night's slate. There was some really solid pitching last night. I doubt any of you or very many of you had the top option on the day. That was Mike Montgomery of Seattle. He threw an absolute gem, complete game shutout, finished with about 46 DraftKings points, I think. The thing that surprised me most about this is he had 10 strikeouts last night. And it's not surprising that he had 10 strikeouts, but he had 10 strikeouts against the Kansas City Royals. That was the most times the Royals had struck out all season so far. So I don't know if that offense is hurting. I don't consider Montgomery. He's not a bad pitcher. He's a guy that they just brought up. He is a little bit of a prospect, but he's not the guy that you would consider was going to be lights out and go out there and shut out one of the teams with the highest batting average in the league. And, again, like I said, he had 10 Ks against the Royals. Nobody's been able to do that all year. So it was a great start for him, but definitely not something that I think most people or anybody really saw coming. A couple people had him in tournaments, and if you did, you got a great return out of him. But I can't think that you were expecting a great return out of him. I think that you probably took him because he was a cheap option. You thought he could reach value for you, and he went out there and thrown a gem. And we've seen that happen before. I don't know if you guys remember. We have a couple games this year where Chris Heston went out there and pretty much did the same thing. Was like $5,000 or $6,000 over on DraftKings and went out and put up a 35, 40-point performance. So it can happen. And, again, it was basically something that would have been strictly a tournament play if you had him. But if you did have him, great job. You got a huge score out of him yesterday. There were a couple other really good pitchers. Madison Bumgarner, our top option on the day yesterday, he finished with 36 DraftKings points. He was unbelievable yesterday. I mean, he was just mowing guys down. In the end of the game, the bullpen blew his, blew it for him at the end there. So he wound up not getting the win. He went 7 innings, gave up a couple hits. Those guys came around and scored. So he could have had an even bigger score. He could have been up into the 40s. But again, I mean, no one's going to complain about the return you got from him. It cost almost $12K to get him yesterday over on DraftKings, but he gave you 36 points on the way back, so you can't really be mad. Even over on FanDuel, I think he gave you about 15. He was 15 or 17, maybe even closer to 20 actually over on Aces. So he was a great start yesterday. If you had him, you probably did pretty well. The other big time starter who did really well yesterday was Chris Archer. He was in the early game, went off at 7 o'clock. And he was the guy that had everybody who had Archer in the early games was up towards the top of the leaderboard after his start. He finished with 31 DraftKings points, so he gave you a really good return on it. Not huge upside for a tournament, but again, if you can get a high-priced pitcher who gets you around 3 points per thousand of cost, you really can't be mad even in a tournament. And cash, he was money. If you used Archer in cash yesterday, you definitely were happy with the return. Like I said, him and Bumgarner were probably the two higher-owned studs that did pretty well. Because not that many people were on Montgomery. You didn't get a big Montgomery contingency yesterday. Moving on from there, you also had guys like Carlos Martinez, who was our other top option yesterday. He finished with 26. So if you put him and Bumgarner together, you got 62 points out of your pitching. The cash line was actually kind of high yesterday because there were some good pitching performances. There was a game in Coors Field. There was a game in Yankee Stadium that saw 19 runs. So, you basically needed, I think the cash line, I had a couple entries in the big Survivor tournament, which was probably the biggest tournament 50-50 wise on DraftKings yesterday. And the cash line was somewhere over 120. So even if you had that pairing of pitchers that we gave you yesterday, you still needed to get about 60, 65, 70 points out of your bats. Basically, that wasn't very hard to do if you had a couple teams. The Phillies were the big team. They were the team that you saw most often on the top rosters in all the largest field pools over on DraftKings. If you look at the Moonshot, if you looked at the the best rosters in the Survivor tournament, which was a big tournament last night, you're going to see a lot of Phillies up there towards the top of the order. There was also a lot of guys from that Colorado game. You had a lot of Yankees, a lot of Phillies, a lot of Colorado Rockies, a lot of Arizona Diamondbacks. That is pretty much the mixture of guys that we saw towards the top of the rosters. And those were the guys that you really needed if you wanted to make a big score yesterday. Couple guys just to mention individually. Maikel Franco stayed absolutely red hot, hit another home run yesterday, finished with 33 DraftKings points. Brett Gardner on the other side finished with another 23 DraftKings point performance. So those two guys have been absolutely money so far, basically over the last week or two. Gardner's a guy that I think should be an all-star, and I might be a little biased as a Yankee fan, but I mean, the way he's been playing lately, you really can't argue with it. And Franco, if he is not the rookie of the year right now, he definitely should be one of the guys up towards the top of the list. He's hitting like 325 right now. He's got 10 home runs already. And remember, we talked about this guy about a month ago when he came up and said, he's got some power. He's supposed to be a pretty good hitter. They don't know if he's going to be a great fielder, but, we're playing daily fantasy, so we don't really care whether or not, he can field. We just care that the guy can hit. And this guy can definitely hit. Let's see, who else do we have? We had Carlos Correa, another rookie who should be up towards the top of the rookie of the year voting. He finished with 32 DraftKings points yesterday. Had a huge day. He was a guy that I was on big. He was actually the only shortstop I used in all my games. I gave him to you guys yesterday. I just thought that he was in a pretty good spot. He's hitting in a good spot in the order. He's got Altuve back with them now, so the top of that Houston order is pretty legit with Springer, Correa, and Altuve as your top three. It goes down pretty fast from there with guys like Gaddis and Carter hitting in the 4 and 5 hole. But, up top of that order, as long as he's up top of that order, he's going to get that extra at bat. He's got guys hitting around him who get on base. He's got guys hitting around him who can knock him around. He has speed. He's got power. I mean, this kid's the total package. So he's another guy you got to keep on your radar, especially when he was cheap. I mean, he was under $4,000 on DraftKings yesterday. And as I said, for $3,900, if you compare him to guys you can get for 3,900 at other positions, you're going to realize he was in a very, very good spot. Another guy who had a big day yesterday was Nolan Arenado. He's one of my favorite young players in baseball. One of the best gloves, which has absolutely nothing to do with fantasy, but just if you watch this kid play, you can appreciate how good he is. And he's pretty good with the stick too. He had another home run, finished with 32 DraftKings points. He had another big day. Anytime he's home in Coors Field, whether they're going up against a righty or a lefty, he's a guy that's kind of in play. So you got to keep an eye on him as well. So that basically sums it up for the recap of yesterday. Let's move on and talk a little bit about today. There are a couple potential weather issues. As always, make sure you guys come back later on in the day, probably about 5:30 every day. Our in-house meteorologist, Danielle Kozlowski, puts up some graphs, some charts, kind of breaks it down for you, tells you, which games might be in danger, which games she thinks might have some delays, and which ones that she would tell you to steer clear of. She's been great so far. She's kept me off a couple places that, when there were some postponements, and she's told me that it's probably going to be good to start some guys that I was on the fence about because of weather. And they worked out and wound up helping me make some money. So it's an invaluable tool that we offer. It's free. Just make sure you stop by the website sometime around 5:30 and look under the DFS weather tab, and you can see her report every day. The two games that we do have to worry about, up in Chicago, the Dodgers and the Cubs, there's a 25% chance of rain as of now up there. And in Colorado, the D-backs and the Rockies, there's a 30% chance of rain coming over there. Like I said, I'll let Danielle handle it later on. Just two things I wanted to throw out there so you guys can consider. Obviously the D-backs Rockies game is going to be one that's used pretty heavily. And there's probably a couple people and a couple bats that some people are going to be targeting in that Dodgers-Cubs game as well. So basically just keep that in mind for you. This way you know that there are some issues. So let's go on and talk a little bit about the Vegas lines today. There's a bunch of things that popped out to me. First thing is the biggest favorite on the day is Garrett Cole going up against Cincinnati. Now, the thing that shocked me the most about this game is not that Cole's a big favorite at minus 190 against Mike Leake, but the run total in this game is only 6.5. Now, it is being played in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a pitcher-friendly park, so I can understand why it's going to be low. Games in Pittsburgh usually do have low totals. And like I said, Cole's been very, very good. He's been lights out. We'll talk about him when we get to the pitcher section. But I just thought it was, kind of jumped out at me that's, such a low total today at only 6.5. Second thing that jumped out at me, the Jordan Zimmerman versus Shelby Miller game, Washington versus Atlanta. There's a 7-run line total there. Zimmerman is the favorite. That's the thing that really jumped out at me. Zimmerman is a big favorite today. He's minus 170. So, basically Vegas is expecting him to have a really, really good game in this one. Shelby's not a horrible pitcher either. So you got two guys that should at the very least be able to limit damage. I don't think either one of these guys is going to go 9 innings and throw a complete game shutout, but they're both very solid pitchers. I would have thought that the run line would be a little bit closer, and we'll talk about that later. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Atlanta is missing Freddie Freeman right now, and that's a really big bat to take out of that lineup. And when you look at that lineup minus Freeman, that lineup wasn't all that imposing with Freeman in there, but without him, it's pretty weak. There's not a lot in there that's going to scare you. Let's see, who else do we have here? The Arizona-Colorado game obviously is something that we want to point out to you. You got 11 runs total in that one. Colorado is favored by minus 140, so Vegas is expecting to see at least 6 runs out of Colorado, maybe even more, probably 3 to 5 runs out of Arizona as well. So again, I say it all the time. You guys know I hate Coors Field, but you have to respect Coors Field. So the fact that there is a game there today, the fact that it has a huge run total, you got to have some exposure to it. If you don't, there's a very good chance that game goes off. It doesn't even need to go off. Even if it's like a 7-4 or a 6-5 kind of game, that's still enough runs that if you have no exposure to it, you're probably going to be behind the 8 ball, because there's probably going to be 2 or 3 guys in that game that put up a 20 or 30 DraftKings point score, and a couple of those auxiliary guys around them that wind up in double digits for cheap prices. So again, whether or not you like Coors Field, you have to respect the guys that are playing there. You have to respect an 11-run total. The last thing I wanted to mention, which was a little surprising to me, Clay Buchholz is a minus 143 favorite over Baltimore. Baltimore actually has a pretty high batting average against right-handed pitching. So I was a little taken back by the fact that he's a big favorite. But again, you got to The run total is kind of high, though. It's an 8.5 run total, which is, a little bit elevated for this kind of matchup. But again, Baltimore is a good hitting team. They do strike out a lot, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about Buchholz. So let's move on to starting pitching for today. Obviously, the clear-cut number one option and the most expensive guy on every site is Gerrit Cole, and it's deservingly so too. He's 11,100 on FanDuel. He's 10,500 on DraftKings, and over on Aces, he's $7,850. He's going up against Cincinnati. Cole right now has a 1.78 ERA. He has a WHIP of 1.07, and he has more than a strikeout per inning. He's got 98 strikeouts and 90 innings of work. So, I mean, those are Cy Young quality numbers at the moment, so you really can't argue with that fact at all. He's been going about 7 innings in each one of his starts, and we said he gets about a strikeout per inning, maybe a little more. So you're probably looking at a projection of 7 innings tonight, 7 strikeouts, probably 7 hits or 8 hits, and 1 to 2 runs. So at those numbers, that would give you a DraftKings score of about 23. If you're playing over on FanDuel, you're probably looking at a score before a win bonus of somewhere between, probably somewhere between 11 and 13. So that's where you're going to be at with him. So if you factor in the win over on FanDuel, you're probably going to wind up somewhere between 15 and 17, which would make him probably the highest scoring pitcher on a day, but also probably puts him a little below value at the price that they're asking. On DraftKings, 23, if you add in the win bonus over there, you get him to about 27, 28. So he'll be in a decent spot. Definitely a cash game option, but probably not the greatest upside if you wanted to use him in a tournament. Basically, for the price that you're paying for him, it seems that he's a little bit expensive. Over on Aces, I think you can definitely get away with paying $78.50 for him. Again, he's probably going to wind up somewhere between, if he gets the win, somewhere between 13 and 17 points over there. So you're getting a little more than 2 points per $1,000 of cost, which I think is pretty solid. Definitely a cash game option over on Aces. And I think he's a guy that you could probably even use in a lot of your tournaments because there aren't a ton of options today at the pitching position. But that actually brings me to my teaching point for today. If you're a guy who's playing in tournaments tonight is a good night to take a chance and try to go against Gerrit Cole. I'm not saying take the bats against him. I don't think Cincinnati's going to go crazy, but don't use him in some of your tournaments. Try to make lineups using pitchers. A pair of pitchers over on a DraftKings that doesn't include Gerrit Cole. And here's the reason why. I tell you guys all the time, when you take a cheap option and you fade the top price pitchers, what you're basically saying is not only do I think that this cheap option is going to have a really good game, but I also think that the guys up on the top aren't going to have a good game. Now, the other night when we were talking in chat was a night where you had like 4 or 5 aces that were up on the mound. So even if you're saying, oh, I didn't like, even last night, oh, I didn't like David Price, I'm going to fade him. Okay, but if you're going to fade him and take a guy who's $5,000, you're not only hoping that David Price has a bad game, but you're hoping that all those other high-priced pitchers that were up there with him don't do their job. So yesterday, if you took a cheaper pitching option, you were hoping that Price had a bad game, Bumgarner had a bad game, who else went on the mound yesterday? Martinez, Greinke. If there's 4 or 5 studs that are going on the mound and you decide to take a cheap option, you're not just fading the guy who you think is going to be the highest owned, but you're basically fading all of those top priced options. You need all of them to basically underperform in order to make your cheap option really be, a guy who stands out. It's not every day that you're going to get a 40-point performance out of your cheap option like, Montgomery gave you yesterday. More often than not, if you're taking a guy at 4 or 5,000 on DraftKings, you're hoping that he gets you 20, 22 points. If you're taking the $3,000 special like the guy Smith from Cincinnati was yesterday on FanDuel, you're hoping he gets you to 10, 11 points. If you're taking a $5,000 pitcher over on Aces, you're hoping he can get you to 12 to 15 points. And I think today there's going to be a couple guys who you can find that do that. Now, the thing about Cole is I don't think Cole is going to go crazy. I don't think he's going to have a huge upside game. Cincinnati doesn't have a very high strikeout rate. Their batting average is decent against right-handed pitching. I think that Cole will still pitch well, but I don't think that he's a guy that you can't fade today because he's going to go out there and put up 40 or 45 DraftKings points. So if he only gets you 25 to 30, 6 or 7,000, who can get you 20 to 25, you might be able to approximate the kind of points you would get from a guy like Cole and make up the difference basically with a cheaper guy who gets you the same amount of points, and give yourself an extra $3,000 to spend up on bets. That extra $3,000 that you have to spend up on bets basically is the difference between the guy who took Cole having to take a cheap option or two, to round out his batting order, and you being able to, have the cheap guy in your batting order still be a $400 to $4,500 kind of guy, basically giving you more upside with your sticks. So that's just our teaching point for today. Wanted you guys to understand that it's one thing to fade a top price pitcher, like Cole, when he's basically the only one on the slate. It's another thing to take a cheap option when you got 4 or 5 top price pitchers on the slate. Because yes, there is a chance that Cole could have a bad game today. And if you fade him, you're going to be in a great spot because he's going to be incredibly highly owned. But at the same point in time, like I said, he's a guy I'm rolling out in my cash games. He's the best pitcher on the day. And I wouldn't fade him at all in any cash games. I think the way to try to beat him today, if you don't like him, is to put in some of those tournament rosters and take some of the cheap pitching options, which gives you a completely different roster than all the people who are trying to fit Cole in. So moving on from there, if Cole's our SP1 today, who are the guys that are in the running for SP2? There's basically 3 of them that I want to mention. The first one is Zimmerman. Now, basically, I was trying to go back and forth between Shelby Miller and Jordan Zimmerman in this game, but the thing that really swayed me was the Vegas line. Zimmerman is a -170 favorite over on the Vegas line over Shelby Miller. And here's why it was a little bit out of whack to me. Atlanta actually has the 8th best batting average against right-handed pitching, and they have one of the lower strikeout rates in the league. I think they're the 3rd lowest K percentage against right-handed pitching. But then when I started digging into it, I realized Freddie Freeman is on the DL and is going to be out for the next 2 weeks. So you're now looking at guys like Kelly Johnson and, Chris Johnson, basically batting in the 3 or 4 hole in that order. That order was never all that strong as it was. You have Jace Peterson leading off. You have Cameron Maybin hitting second. You're probably going to have, like I said, like a Kelly Johnson or a Chris Johnson in the 3 or 4 hole. They've been using Przinsky lately. I think they actually sent Betancourt down. So I don't even know if they have a backup catcher or who their backup catcher is at the moment. But there's not any bats in that lineup that really scare me. Zimmerman has been pretty good in the starts that he's had recently. He had 2 starts where he got blown up, but all the rest of his starts, he's been scoring basically between 18 and 25 DraftKings points, which at his price today is exactly what you would need out of him in order for him to make value. He's about $2,800 cheaper over on DraftKings than a guy like Cole, and I think he's pretty solid. The one place I don't really love him is over on FanDuel. At FanDuel, his price is $8,300. So you're basically going to need about 16 to 17 points out of this guy. And I don't see him really getting that for you. I don't think he's going to go shutout 7 innings with 6 strikeouts and pick up the win, which is what he would need to get to 17. I do think he's solid over on DraftKings, and I also think that he's a little pricey on aces. He's almost $7,000 on aces. I was hoping he was going to be closer to $6,000, but I still think he's a decent play over there. He's probably going to get you somewhere between 11 and 15 points on aces. So if you're paying 67 for him, I think 67.50 is his price. It's not too restrictive, but it doesn't really give you a ton of upside either. For cash games, definitely. For tournaments, I don't know if he's a guy that I think has the upside to really get you to the top if you're trying to cash. The next guy I wanted to talk about is Clay Buchholz. Now, like I said, I'm not really a huge Buchholz fan. He's very erratic. He's had some really good starts, 30-point starts, high 20-point starts, DraftKings scores. And then he's also had some starts where he's wound up in the negative. So there's really no way to gauge how he could be. He goes up against a Baltimore team that is just as maddening to try to figure out because they have the 5th or 6th highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, but they also have the 5th or 6th highest batting average against right-handed pitching. So there's an upside and a downside to using this guy today. He's been averaging about 7 innings with 6 strikeouts, though, giving up about 3 runs and about 1.3 walks and hits per inning. So his scores are basically going to break down to about 18 or 19 DraftKings points, probably somewhere around 9 to 11 points over on FanDuel. Now, if you add in and factor in a win over there, definitely going to pay off his price over on DraftKings. On FanDuel, though, he's like 8,400. So even if he does factor in the win based off his averages, he's probably still going to fall short of reaching value for you. So he's definitely not a guy I think is an option at FanDuel. Excuse me. Over on aces, though, he's really cheap. I think he's like 57.50. And if you look at his game log over on Aces, he's put up scores 12, 14, 16 points. So at 57.50, that's definitely somebody that's in play. I don't like the fact that the run line is 8.5 over there, but I do like the fact that he's a minus 141 favorite. The last pitcher I want to mention is Roenis Elias. Basically, if you watched that game last night, Mike Montgomery completely shut down that Kansas City offense. I have no idea why they're struggling so much, but like I said, it was the most strikeouts they've had all season. They looked horrible, and they're playing in a very pitcher-friendly park. This game will be in Safeco again up in Seattle. And again, Seattle's a great place to pitch, very easy place for you to pitch in. And Elias has been pretty good over there. He had 32 DraftKings points his last time out. It was a high K game against Houston. Houston's actually a really good matchup for pitchers. So I want to take that game with a little bit of a grain of salt. That's one that I'll kind of excuse and put over to the side as an outlier. In the other games, he's basically been averaging just shy or right around 20 points, which, again, at his price on DraftKings of 71 or 72, I think he is. 74. At 74, I think he's okay. I think that's right around where you would expect him to be if he has a pretty good game. On FanDuel, 7,700. I think that might be doable as well. I am expecting probably about 15 FanDuel points out of him if he can pick up the win. I think he'll have 10 or 11 points irregardless of the win. So if he's picking up the win as the favorite, he is a small favorite today over Kansas City in a low run total game. I think he might be a decent option. Let's see. Over on Aces, he's 5,500. So I think he definitely has some upside for a tournament over there. But I wouldn't go crazy on this guy in cash because Kansas City, again, they're one of the highest batting averages in the league and usually one of the lowest K percentages. So I think that game yesterday was more of an outlier for him than the norm. I'd really have to see them struggle more than one game before I start, targeting pitchers against them. They've been a team that I haven't wanted to target against all season. So basically that breaks it down for the pitchers I want to use. There is one guy I want to caution against as well, and that's Jamie Garcia. Garcia is going up against Miami. Miami has the second highest batting average against left-handed pitching, and they do have a high strikeout rate against right-handed pitching, but against left-handed pitching, they're pretty much middle of the pack. I think they're a little bit below 21% or so, somewhere between like 13th and 17th overall in K percentage against lefties. So I definitely think this is going to be a tough matchup for Garcia. I don't like the fact that his price is up. And, you got guys like Stanton and Ozuna in that lineup who I'll mention in a minute. Those guys absolutely smash left-handed pitching. So if you're going to have some big bats that do well against left-handed pitching, I definitely think that this is a situation where you kind of want to avoid using a guy like Garcia. I don't know how many of those Miami bats I would target outside of the two guys that I just mentioned, but I definitely wouldn't be looking to target Garcia very heavily. So that basically breaks it down for our pitching options. Now, it's a pretty small slate. I think we only have maybe 8 or 9 games on this late slate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of use this as a teaching point moment to go over with you guys how I come up with the players that I talk about on the show. A couple people have asked me in chat, how do you get onto these guys? Why do you pick these guys, or how do you go through the list? Well, for starters, I don't go through the list position by position. What I do is I go through the matchups pitcher by pitcher and team by team. So, for example, we'll start at the top. In a day like yesterday, I'll look at the spreads. So the first game that obviously pops out to me for today is going to be the Arizona and Colorado matchup because that has the highest total on it. So the first thing I would want to do is say, okay, if that's going to be the highest total game, let me take a look at the pitchers in that game. Let me take a look at what their strengths and weaknesses are. And then let me figure out which guys on the other team match up best with those strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, you look at a pitcher like David Hale for Colorado. You see that in 2015, Hale has a .311 batting average with 5 home runs allowed and 14 innings pitched to left-handed batters. So that would jump out at me right away as saying, okay, well, he really is struggling with lefties. Let's see if this is a trend or if he just had a bad game. So you go back and look at 2014. You see that he gave up a .289 batting average with a .175 whip, 44 hits, 22 walks, and 37 innings of work against left-handed bats. All right, so now you have a 2-year sample size that's a little bit bigger, and it's both basically pointing out the same thing, that David Hale struggles against left-handed bats. So if you're making a team, what you want to try to do is target left-handed bats against a guy like Hale. All right, so now after you do that, you can go over to MLB.com like we showed you, the first day, and you go to sortable team stats. And you could probably even do this over on Fangraphs as well. but you pull up the team. So you pull up the team that he's going up against. So Hale's going up against Arizona today. And you pull up Arizona versus right-handed pitching 2015. So what you want to do is you want to say, okay, this is a guy that I know struggles against left-handed bats. Let me see which guys on Arizona are hitting right-handed pitching well, and see if any of those guys that are hitting right-handed pitching well happen to be a left-handed bat who's going to be in a good spot in the order, and click off all the other boxes that we have. So when you go do that, you see that you got a guy like David Peralta who's hitting over 300 against right-handed pitching this year. You realize Peralta's a left-handed bat. So now you know that Hale struggles with a left-handed bat, and you know that Peralta hits right-handed pitching well. So you have a pitcher who struggles with left-handers. You have a left-hander who hits right-handed pitching well. You put those two things together, and that's how we get it, and we say this is going to be a good matchup for him. Now, you realize that this game is taking place in Coors Field, which is a park bump for him. Even though Arizona's a good hitter's park, it's not Coors Field. So for a guy who's been playing most of his games in Arizona and, you know, the other half of them at various parks around the country, now he's getting to go into the best hitter's park in the majors. So he's somebody who has to be up on your radar. So Peralta was the first guy that pops out for me. He's somebody I think you guys should consider as an outfielder today. Peralta usually bats fifth in that order, so he is in a good spot. He has a good chance to drive in some runs. He has a good chance to, you know, basically make some noise and do some damage. The second guy that pops out to me in the same situation is Jake Lamb. Jake Lamb is another left-handed bat, hits right-handed pitching pretty well. He's at about a 280 or 290. The problem I have with Lamb is he's been really struggling lately, but he's still hitting in the two-hole right now for Arizona. So if he's cheap on whatever site you're playing, he's going to be hitting in the two-hole. He has a good matchup against a guy who struggles with lefties, and he's in the best hitter's park in the majors. You know, he's another guy that has to go on your short list of guys to consider. So those are the two lefties that hit right-handed pitching really well. If you're looking on that page, you're also going to see that they have a couple right-handed bats that hit righties very well, namely A.J. Pollock and Goldschmidt. Goldschmidt's at like 360, a ton of home runs. He's an absolute stud. You don't even need to waste another minute on him. He's somebody who should be on your short list of players anyway. But a guy like Pollock, when you look at his numbers, like I said, he's hitting just shy of 300, has a little bit of pop. He's been driving in some runs. He's up on top of that order now, so he's been scoring some runs. He's another guy that you want to consider. The problem I have with Pollock today is his price is very expensive. He's got the Coors Field bump basically going on from everywhere. So I don't know if he's a top option, but he's definitely somebody who you should have on your short list and maybe over on the side as kind of like a maybe guy where, you know, if you can fit him in or if you're trying to stack a couple bats from that Arizona game, he's definitely one of the guys that you want included in that stack. But again, I don't know if he's a standalone kind of play that you go out and target by himself. So again, the other side of that game, you know, like we said, it's expecting a lot of runs. So now we're going to go and look at the other side of that game. Arizona's pitching a guy named Allen Webster. Webster so far this year hasn't had a ton of innings. Last year, he had a 152 whip and 31 innings pitched versus left-handed batters. In 2013, he had a 391 batting average with 7 home runs and 14 innings pitched against left-handed batters. So if you're going to attack Webster, the way you really want to do it is try to find some left-handed bats that you think can hit him. So again, you go over to Colorado, you go to MLB.com, you go to Fangraphs, you go to the Colorado team, you pull up how does Colorado do against right-handed bats so far in 2015. And the guy who really jumps out at you is Charlie Blackmon. Blackman's been absolutely on fire lately. In 6 of his last 9 games, he's got a double-digit return. Over his last 4 games, he's been averaging 19 DraftKings points. And again, his price is up around $4,900. So he's getting a little expensive, which is going to push people off him. Basically, Mike Trout was $5,000 yesterday. You can get guys like Bryce Harper and Stanton for 54 to 58 every day. So I don't think you're going to have too many casual players who are clicking into the Charlie Blackmon button. But again, you heard the numbers. It's a great matchup for him. Webster really struggles against left-handed bats. Blackmon has been leading off on top of that Colorado order. He's at home in Coors Field, great place to hit. So he checks off all the boxes today. He's the guy who stands out to me the most as somebody that you want to target against right-handed pitching, especially weak right-handed pitching that struggles against left-handed bats. Now, again, like Arizona, there are also some right-handed bats that stand out to you. And if you look at the numbers for Webster, what you want to try to stay away from is extreme splits guys. Webster is not one of those guys. It's not like he's giving up a 300 batting average to lefties and holding righties to a 120 or a 140 average. His average is a little bit lower against right-handers, but right-handers are still hitting him around pretty well. So you probably know where I'm going with this on Colorado. That also means that you got to look at guys like DJ LeMahieu if he's batting up high in the order. You got to look at guys like Tulo, who is, obviously one of the best shortstop options every day. You got to keep looking at a guy like Arenado. Arenado's been absolutely on fire too. He's averaging 18 DraftKings points over his last 4 games, and he's got double-digit points in 6 of his last 9. So definitely cash game safe. Definitely has tournament upside. Tulo is the guy who I'm a little bit less in love with. Basically, he's just been hitting singles lately. And while that's not bad, if you get a shortstop, at $3,000, you really got to pay up everywhere from Tulo. If I take like a Eric Ibar at half the price of Tulo and he hits a couple singles for me, I'm happy. But if I spend up to get a guy like Tulo, I expect more than a couple singles. I expect some RBIs. I expect an extra base hit, maybe even a home run. If all he's going to do is go 2 for 4 with 2 singles and a walk and a run scored, he's basically not going to give you a big upside. Again, you're paying $5,000-$6,000 for a guy like Tulo on sites like FanDuel and and DraftKings, and close to $6,000 on a site like Fantasy Aces. I just don't think he's giving you enough of a return if all he's going to be doing is hitting a couple singles or walking once or twice and scoring a run. If he's not hitting for extra bases, if he's not knocking guys in and getting RBIs, there's no reason to pay up for him. You can get better value from cheaper guys, in my opinion, at the position. So moving on from there, you got Boston taking on a guy like Bud Norris. So you look at Norris's numbers. His numbers: 345 batting average to left-handed bats, 3 home runs in 21 innings worth of work so far this year. 255 with 12 home runs in 84 innings last year. 333 with 6 home runs in 24 innings back in 2013. So left-handed bats is basically the way you want to attack a guy like Norris. So again, I go over to MLB.com. I go over to Fangraphs. I type in, Boston Red Sox. I put right-handed pitcher. And what it spits out to me is a guy like Brock Holt. So a guy like Brock Holt has a high average. He's been hitting in that 2 or 3 hole for Boston. So he's somebody that's in play. Third base eligible on some sites, outfield eligible on others, third base and outfield on a site like DraftKings. So he's pretty cheap usually most days. Doesn't have a ton of power, so he's not going to be the guy that hits you 2 home runs. But he is a very good average hitter. He's a consistent hitter. He'll get you 2 or 3 hits. He'll walk here or there. He'll steal a base. He'll score a run. Again, the difference between him and a guy like Tulo is, Tulo you're paying, $5,000 for on FanDuel or DraftKings. A guy like Brock Holt you're getting for $3,000 or even below $3,000 over on FanDuel. So you can live with him doing, a couple singles and a walk and a run scored. When you're paying up for a guy, though, you really want to get more than that out of him. Other things that stand out with that Boston team, you have David Ortiz. Ortiz does not have a high average, but he does have a lot of home runs, hits right-handed pitching pretty well. So he's another guy that stands out as somebody who should go on your short list. Let's see, who else do we have? Oh, Mookie Betts was the other guy I wanted to mention. Betts has been on fire right now. He has double-digit points in 8 of his last 9. He's averaging 15 points over his last 9 games. He's still not too expensive on some sites and in some spots. And again, he's the right-handed bat going up against a right-handed pitcher, but he has a high average against right-handers, and right now he's been absolutely on fire. So he's another guy that I would put on that short list for myself. Moving on to the next game, you have Kendall Graveman from Oakland going up against Texas. He's a rookie, so we don't have a lot of data to go back years, but so far this year, 288 batting average, 158 whip, and 3 home runs in 25 innings against left-handed bats. So again, you look at Texas, you look at how they do against right-handed bats. The 2 guys that stand out, Prince Fielder has a 377 batting average versus right-handed pitching, 7 home runs and 162 at-bats. So he's definitely somebody that you have to consider. You have to, put on your radar in this matchup with Graveman. The other guy who really stands out is Mitch Moreland. Moreland is a 313 batting average, 7 home runs and 128 at-bats. So Moreland actually has more home run power than Fielder does. Fielder is hitting a little bit better for average. Unfortunately, a lot of places they're both listed as first baseman, where you can get Moreland as an outfielder or Fielder as a DH if you can fit them both in on a site like Aces. They're both in a good matchup. Graveman's not a great pitcher, so either one of those guys could be a good play today. You're also going to see a lot of people using Joey Gallo, left-handed bat, young kid. Again, he's kind of feast or famine. He definitely has home run power. He definitely swings for the fences every time he gets up, but he's just as likely to hit a home run as he is to strike out 3 times in my eyes. And basically when he was cheap, when you were getting him at, 3,600 on DraftKings, below 3,000 on FanDuel, 4,200, 4,400 over on Aces. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can take that chance for the upside. But now that he's come up a little bit everywhere to over 4,000 on DraftKings and, well, the high 4,000s, mid 4,000s on Aces, I really don't think he's a great play anymore. But again, if you want to roll him out there and hope that today's the home run upside day, definitely a tournament option, definitely someone you can use over there. But he's not a guy I would be using in cash, even though he does probably have a little bit of a splits advantage. Then there are other guys where you look at like Danny Duffy. Duffy's numbers aren't horrible. So there's nothing that really pops out at me as you want to target this or you want to target that. But if you look at the Seattle Bats, the one thing that we do know is you definitely want to target Nelson Cruz anytime he's going up against a left-handed pitcher. So with Duffy being a left-handed pitcher, you definitely got to put Cruz on your short list as well. Again, not a great hitter's park. They're not expecting a ton of runs in that game. But if you look at the numbers that Cruz has against left-handed pitching, he's definitely somebody that's in play, definitely somebody that should be on your short list. But he's probably the only guy on that game that I'd put in there. So moving on from him, the same thing pretty much goes for Wandy Rodriguez against Oakland. Wandy Rodriguez is a left-handed pitcher. He does have a little bit of reverse splits going on, but if you look at the Oakland lineup, you look at their page, they don't have a ton of guys that do great against left-handed pitching from the left side. This year they have a couple guys whose averages might be a little higher than normal, but it's not something that I think you can target and really try to go after. The only guy who really stands out on Oakland is Marcus Semien. Semien does hit much better against left-handed pitching. And he's really the only right-handed bat in Oakland that they move up in the order when they play a lefty. So I expect to probably see him hitting in the 2-hole today, probably in front of Zobrist. And he's a guy that does get on base pretty well against left-handed pitching. So he could be a cheap option at short that you should put on your list. Probably the guy that I'm going to come down to if I'm not using Tulo. Moving on from there, sometimes you start doing this and you try to find somebody, and there's really nobody that works out for you. And that was the case today with Jimmy Nelson. Nelson has given up a .311 batting average with 6 home runs and 30 innings pitched this year to left-handed batters. Last year, it was .275 with 5 home runs and 35 innings pitched. So left-handed batters is really the way that you want to try to go against Nelson. If a guy like Daniel Murphy, who was a low strikeout guy, was somebody that was, playing today, I definitely think he would be a guy that I would target because he's a high average guy and a low strikeout guy. Nelson does have a lot of strikeouts. So while a guy like Lucas Duda might seem like a decent play in this spot, it depends what site you're playing on. If you're playing him on DraftKings, where it doesn't matter if he goes 1 for 4 with a home run and 3 strikeouts, then yeah, roll him out there. He might hit that home run today. But at the same point in time, if you're playing on a site like FanDuel that takes away negatives, Duda's a high strikeout guy and Nelson's a high strikeout pitcher. So there's a good chance you're going to wind up, or even on Aces where they subtract for strikeouts, there's a good chance you're going to have a couple negative events as well. So if he doesn't hit that home run for you, if he just has like a single and 2 strikeouts, you're going to wind up with a 0 over on Aces because the positives and negatives are going to cancel yourself out. Same thing on FanDuel. He just kind of feels like one of those guys today that's going to finish with, 0.25 or 0.5 or 0.75. And for the price that you got to pay up for him, I don't think it's going to be worth it. So after looking over this situation with the Mets team, think about it. I mean, the left-handed bats on the Mets you want to use are all high strikeout guys. You got guys like Granderson, guys like Duda. The guys that they have available to them at the moment just really don't seem to be in a good matchup with Nelson. So I don't really have anybody on the Mets that I'm targeting, but I did just want to mention some of those guys. I think that Nelson might be a sneaky pitching option for your tournaments today as well, because there's really nobody that you're afraid of. So just keep that in mind. Moving on from there, you got a guy like Ryan Vogelsong. Vogelsong, .275 batting average, 9 home runs and 29 innings pitched so far in 2015 to left-handed batters. Last year, he was .287 with 8 home runs and 85 innings. So San Diego doesn't have a ton of left-handed batters that you would want to target against them. There's really only 2 guys. Yonder Alonso has a high average against right-handed pitching, and Will Venable has a little bit of pop as a lefty against right-handed pitching. So those would basically be the only 2 guys that I think you can consider rolling out there. Again, I don't love either one of them, but they are both cheap. It's not a great hitter's park that they're in, but if you needed a cheap option, I think that those guys make for decent tournament plays. I don't think either one of them is somebody I'd use in cash, especially not in a pitcher-friendly ballpark. But again, they're options that I want to mention to you. Next guy to talk about is Mike Leake. So you look at Mike Leake's numbers. 259, 10 home runs, 51 innings pitched in 2015 against left-handed batters. In 2014, he was 290 with 10 home runs and 89 innings pitched. He also gave up 13 home runs to right-handed bats. So he's been giving up home runs to guys on both sides of the plate, but a much higher average to left-handed batters. So to me, when you look at Pittsburgh against right-handed pitching, that puts a guy like Neil Walker in play. Walker's a switch hitter, but he's much better batting from the left side against right-handed pitching. And when they play against a right-handed pitcher, he sometimes finds himself batting in the cleanup spot. So if you get Neil Walker in a cleanup spot today, I think his price yesterday was only like $3,000 on DraftKings, which is dirt cheap. He might have been like 25 or 26 on FanDuel as well. So if you're looking for a salary saver, here's a guy with good lineup placement and in a very good matchup today. Again, that game's in Pittsburgh, though, so it's not the greatest hitter's park, so you don't want to go too heavy with targeting too many guys from this game. A guy like Gregory Polanco's been pretty hot. If he's up towards the top of the order, he's somebody I think that you can look at. Again, he's a left-handed bat going up against Leake. Leake struggles with the lefties, so Polanco could be in play. The sneaky play, if you're looking for home run upside, is probably Pedro Alvarez at third base or first base. I think he's eligible at both on a couple sites. Alvarez is basically just a guy who hits a lot of home runs against right-handed pitching, and Leake is a right-handed pitcher who gives up a lot of home runs to left-handed bats. So when you have a high home run pitcher going up against a guy that has a lot of power, the splits matchup works out well for him. Again, not the greatest park to hit home runs in, but you definitely got to consider Pedro Alvarez as somebody who's in play. The other two guys I want to mention real quick, like I said, he gave up 13 home runs last year to right-handed bats as well. So if you want to use a Marte, if you want to use a McCutchen, I think both of those guys could be guys that could take him yard. But again, he's much worse batting average wise against left-handed pitching. So I think that would probably be the way that you wanted to, wanted to try to attack him. Let's see. We're almost down to the end. There's only a couple pitchers left. Guy like Bolsinger going for the Dodgers. He faces the Cubs today. So far this year, he has a 280 batting average against left-handed batters. Last year, he allowed left-handed batters to hit 337. So the one left-handed batter that stands out as doing well against right-handed pitching on the Cubs is Anthony Rizzo. Rizzo's got a 291 average, 14 home runs, and 203 at-bats this year against right-handed pitching. So if you're looking for a target on the Cubs, he's probably that guy. If you're looking for some cheap bats, you can also look at maybe a Montero or a Chris Coughlin. Those are some cheap salary-saving options you can throw in there. But the one guy who I think I would actually look to target and I like the most in that game is definitely Rizzo. Let's see. You got Matt Latos. Latos is going up against the Cardinals. Latos struggles against left-handed bats. He has a 333 average so far this year against left-handed bats. Struggled against them in his past as well. If you look at the Cards team, though, Matt Carpenter's hurt right now. He's out, so you really can't use him as a target. The only guy who I think you can really look at is Colton Wong. Wong, 283 batting average, 7 home runs, and 187 at-bats. He also has 11 doubles and 2 triples. So he basically has 20 extra base hits against right-handers so far this year. You're probably going to find him on top of that order. He should be hitting either leadoff or in the 2 spot. And again, we've seen Latos struggle this year. We've also seen him be a little bit better lately. But, I just really like this matchup for Wong. Again, at a tough-to-fill second base position. And Wong's price has come down from earlier in the year. So I definitely think he's somebody who you can still roll out there in a lot of your lineups today. Again, the last guy I want to mention, the guy who I told you I think is going to be struggling a little bit today and I don't want to use, is Jamie Garcia. This is a tough matchup for him. Miami has the second best batting average against left-handed pitching at 274. You have a guy like Stanton in the middle of that order with all that power, 283, 8 home runs, and 54 at-bats. You also have Marcell Ozuna, who might even be better against left-handed pitching than Stanton is. He has a 396 batting average so far this year against left-handed pitching. And with teams pitching around Stanton, Ozuna is the guy who protects him in the order. If you have teams keep pitching around Stanton, he's going to get up with guys on base a lot. So he's got a chance to drive in some runs, a chance to hit some home runs. And a guy with almost a 400 batting average, he's almost a lock for at least one hit. And, there's a good chance he could be in there for multiple hits. So that's pretty much the breakdown of today's slate. So let's give you an idea of how we're going to be building our rosters. For cash games, like I said, I think Garrett Cole is far and away the guy who stands out as the biggest stud. I'm going to have a lot of exposure to him on DraftKings and on Aces in my cash games. If I play cash games at all tonight on FanDuel, he's probably going to be the pitcher that I roll out there. I don't like the fact that his price is a little too pricey on FanDuel, which is why I say I'm probably going to be staying away from cash games on FanDuel because I don't want to pay $11,000 for Cole, but I also don't see anybody else who really stands out to me as somebody who I have to have. So that's basically breaking down the pitching. In the tournaments, I will be using a little bit of guys like Elias. I will be using a lot of Zimmerman. I may even sprinkle in a little bit of Buchholz here and there, and maybe even a little bit of Jimmy Nelson in tournaments. Again, Nelson has that strikeout upside that we like to use in tournaments. He could be a guy who goes out there, and I don't think anybody would be shocked if he strikes out 7 or 8 Mets today in 6 or 7 innings. More likely 6 innings the way that he pitches. But again, if he can limit the damage, get you 6 innings, get you 8 strikeouts, he's going to give you a really nice return on his price, and I think he's going to be a lot lower owned. So he's a guy I think you can use in tournaments. As far as bats go, I think you have to have exposure to Coors today on one side or the other. Colorado's the favorite, so I think you got to have a guy like Blackman, a guy like Arenado, try to fit them into your roster. If you're looking for salary savers, a guy like Nick Hundley has a pretty high batting average. If you can get him in at catcher, Willen Rosario in spots is cheap, although we like to play him more against left-handed pitching. You might be able to get a Ben Paulson in there cheap. He's like 3,400 on DraftKings. I think he's below 3,000 on FanDuel as well. Those are guys that you want to look at. Over on the other side for Arizona, like we said, you definitely want to look at those lefties, guys like Lamb, guys like Peralta. They can give you a little bit of salary savings. You want to look at a guy like Goldie because basically he just hits everybody. He's just very good, and the matchup's not bad. So Goldie's definitely somebody that you want to see if you can have him play as well. Those are going to be guys who I'm starting to build my rosters around there. Like I said, there's some cheap options. We're going to give you guys a values play article coming up in a little while. Guys like a Brock Holt are in a good spot. You can find a guy like Neil Walker really, really cheap on a lot of sites today. He's in a good matchup. So there's definitely a lot of guys and enough value that you can round out your rosters. The other thing is the pitching's not that expensive today. So you're going to be able to spend up on bats and go get the guys that you really want. Again, make sure you're watching around lineup lock. You're going to see some cheap options, good splits matchup that are batting higher in the order than they usually do. And those are the guys that you really need to round out your rosters. Getting one of those guys who's in a good spot that can get you 8 to 10 points and also allow you to get one of these big studs like a Tulo or a Goldie into your lineup. I can't tell you guys how valuable it is to find some of those guys. So if you are able to find them, make sure you throw those guys in your lineups. Again, make sure you watch the lineups when the lineups come out. You can do that over on our RotoCurve page. Go to rotocurve.com. Go up to the top. You'll see where it says MLB DFS. There's some MLB tools, and those tools are all under there, including the lineups page, our lineup picks, some pitcher stuff, some umpire stuff. There's a whole bunch of data that you can look at over there that'll help you make your decisions today. So that's basically it. That's the breakdown for today. I thank you guys for coming and enjoying another episode of The Curve with us. As always, my name is Benny Ricciardi. You can follow me over on Twitter at BennyR11. My partner, Josh Kalachi, is on vacation this week, but he'll be back this weekend. You can follow him at Josh Kalachi. And make sure you follow the RotoCurve site at RotoCurve over there. If you haven't signed up yet, come over to rotocurve.com. Sign up for an account. It's free. You start earning curve points for your participation in the community. You can trade those in for RotoCurve swag if you want a t-shirt or a hat or something. You could also trade it in to get extra money to play on the site. So it's basically free money just for being part of our community and contributing and throwing in your 2 cents. We wanted to make sure that we had people that were engaged, and we wanted to make sure that we gave back to the people who put the time in to write some forum posts and to check out some of the tools that we have. And so far it's been going pretty well. Wrath and Jason were back from the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. I think Wrath is probably on a plane right now, and Jason's probably on the bus on the way back to Philly. So those guys will be coming to you later this week, giving you some of the stuff that they heard over there. There was a lot of juicy gossip going on, a lot of information, a lot of people that were, talking about certain things, and a lot of stuff going on over there. So they're probably going to do another State of DFS for you sometime this week. They'll break all that down for you and give you, information that you're not really getting from anywhere else. So like I said, that's basically breaking it down. That's our show for today. I thank you guys for coming. This has been another episode of The Curve, and stay classy DFS.